You will hear that Kendy was living a double life for quite some time. And speaking about impossible, you will hear from the state's psychological expert that it is impossible to determine Kendy's suicidality, whether she was suicidal. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jason Johnson. Your Honor, ladies, gentlemen of the jury, counsel. I want to start with the night of February 2nd. Dan calls 911 about 10:45. You'll hear that he stayed on the phone. His demeanor on that 911 call, weeping, particularly when the dispatcher or the 911 operator mistakes that he was calling about his son about 2-3 minutes into the call instead of his wife. She asks him, "How old is your son?" And he was confused. And that reaction there. And law enforcement shows up, and they initially, officer or deputy Wheeler, who's relatively new, makes some observations. Well, his cheeks are red, he's crying, but I don't see tears. And he takes some initial photos. At that point, it's a death investigation. Officers show up, detectives show up, 3 detectives, Detective Wheeler, Detective Wheeler, and Detective Law&Crime. And obviously, in this type of case, death investigation, you're going to do some due diligence and rule out anything untoward. But Detective Northrop then takes photos 7 hours later, 6 to 7 hours later, based upon the timestamps of the photos, where she's still in the tub, still with blood. The medical examiner refers to a blood line across her body where she had been sitting in the tub and the water had gone down, and you see that blood line. You'll see the amount of blood caked on her back when she was removed from the autopsy examination. They do their investigation. Initially, they conduct a search warrant at that time. And they leave about 9:45. Officers and law enforcement leave about 9:45 on the 3rd, the morning of the 3rd. Later that morning, autopsy was performed by Dr. Howard. And Dr. Howard specifically found that the cause of death...
Objection, Your Honor. Sidebar? Yes.
Members of the jury, this is going to take a little longer conversation with the attorney, so I'm going to excuse you shortly while I continue discussing with the lawyers. All rise, please. You can be seated. We were having a sidebar that wanted to be picked up by the court reporter, and so, Ms. Woodson, if you'd like to state your objection.
Thank you. Your Honor, I'm going to try to keep this very simple and short. This was litigated well before trial. Dr. Howard's conclusions are hearsay. They can't come in except through Dr. Howard. Now, there are going to be some experts in this case who rely on other people's work, to include Dr. Howard's work. But those experts are going to be testifying about their own opinions. Dr. Howard's work, his opinions cannot come in. It's just hearsay. Just because something's written in a report, just because something's provided to the defense, and just because something's given to another expert in formulating their own opinions, doesn't mean that everything comes in. Everything that comes into evidence has to comply with the rules of evidence. And this is rank hearsay. And this is litigated, and the court gave a ruling on this. We're getting close to sanctionable. I don't think the defense should be permitted to get into this, especially in opening statements. We have no way of knowing what evidence is going to come in. And this is something, again, it's just been litigated, and Mr. Johnson should be held to the rules the same way the state is. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, it's, as mentioned, it's very clear from both our experts and the state's experts that every single expert has reviewed the autopsy report and has made a conclusion on whether or not they agree or disagree with the cause of death. For instance, Dr. Desmond, defense expert, has reviewed everything, done the biomechanical engineering, all that. Detective Lalliton had a conversation with the replacement of Dr. Howard in January of last year, trying to see if there was anything different that he could find. And he did. Dr. Mott confirmed that the cause of death was gunshot wound to the neck. That's why, frankly, I think it's disingenuous for the state 4 weeks before trial to change their theory, and why we wanted to
All right, let me get you up there. That's not what we're talking about. This was the subject of a motion in limine, specifically that any opinion of Dr. Howard as to the cause of death being gunshot wound, unless offered by Dr. Howard himself.
And he's
testimony.
we plan on calling him.
Well, I granted the motion in limine, and I'm not allowing that until such time as that comes in as testimony. I think it's, at least as I understood from the motion in limine, it's debatable whether or not he ultimately is testifying, and if that ultimately is his opinion, and you cannot bootstrap it through other experts, put his opinion in. Again, we had this hearing, I'm relying on the arguments made at the motion in limine at the time I granted it. So I'm sustaining the objection not to provide that opinion in an opening statement.
Okay. We would take exception for the right here.
Okay?
Thank you.
All right, we'll bring the jury, and I'll expect you to move forward with your opening without reference to Dr. Howard.
Miss Howard had a gunshot wound lodged in the C-tube. That bleeding was coming from the mouth. That the bullet went through the tongue. You'll see the gun. It's a .380. Kind of a short, not like a normal gun with a long barrel. So the gun with a stub nose or a short barrel that would not be able to go past the teeth and rest on the tongue. You'll hear that during the course of the investigation, Detective Lallaton and others went up to Alaska to see if Mr. Howard was out of the affair. They didn't find any. You'll hear about the affair that Miss Howard kept secret from even her best friends. During the course of the investigation, there were a second search warrant done a couple weeks later, in February 17th. They go to the house, they examine various things, and then at this time, they send items to ballistics. They use Washington State Patrol, they have a forensic unit, to examine some of the evidence. During that time, Washington State Patrol found several key things. The gun had Kendy's blood on it, on one of the grips. It had her DNA on it, and another male's DNA. Dan was excluded from the gun. You'll hear that the coroner listed this as, initially, the photos that she had saved are called Howard suicide. But as the course of the investigation, Detective Lallaton very quickly believed that there was something untoward about Dan. And that's based upon when Dan was he was on 911 when officers showed up. At some point later in the morning, they let him start doing notifications. He called his son. He called Brooke, his stepdaughter. That phone call you'll hear was short. You'll hear that right after that, a few minutes later, she called back. When she called back, naturally, she sounded upset, and Detective Lallaton overheard that conversation. And from then, he specifically started accusing Dan, you did this, didn't you? And Detective Lallaton conducted a couple of years of investigation trying to find Dan. At some point, officers obviously fill out police reports, detectives fill out police reports. The first time a police report mentions anything about a carotid restraint wasn't until April of 2023. Prior to that, Detective Lallaton had a conversation with the replacement, Dr. Mott, a replacement for Dr. Howard after he had retired, to see if his opinions would be any different. It wasn't until after that sometime in this police report there's a mention of carotid restraint. But you'll hear that there is no damage to the hyoid. There is no petechia. She just had her nails done. There is no DNA or samples from Dan under her fingernails. There is no defensive wounds from being restrained that Miss Howard put on Dan. You hear that she took a bath every night. You will also hear that night she had an iPhone, and like a lot of iPhones, it keeps track of your steps. You'll see that she went up the floor, do her nightly routine, took a bath. You'll see that at one point, about 10-11-ish, she took 43 steps. There's a wet towel in the bedroom. Her purse was now in the bathroom where she normally kept the gun. 43 steps. The bath mat was wet, but nothing else around was wet. Just the bathroom. 43 steps. You'll hear that from one of the defense experts, that Dr. Desmond, that when he examined the evidence and the scene, that it is consistent. The body position, the mechanics, the gun placement is consistent with suicide. We talked about Philip Hanger, Dr. Hanger. You'll hear about some of the things that would lead to suicide. Dr. Hanger will testify that a person who's trying to break off from alcohol is susceptible to suicide. You'll hear that she is not content with her body. She is struggling with whether she wants to leave Dan even after everything went down. In fact, what you will hear is that her brother and her got in a huge fight. The last text that Miss Howard sent was to her friend Tana about how her brother had blocked her because they got in a fight, brother. So during all this investigation, members of the state investigators, Ms. Marhofer, was going through the phones. While going through the phones, she came across a photo from about 7 months prior, from July of 2020. This photo has a large bruise that kind of trails up to the center. Also, she has a bruising on her arm and some red. She had sent her paramour, her secret lover, Mr. Prado, and her friend Michelle messages around that time. And she never specifically says, Dan did it. But you'll hear that 2 other people were present. Neighbors who saw her when they were there, their neighbors, and they were loading up the boat to go to Dorshak. Dan and Kendy were loading up the boat. And she had slipped on the step that leads to the front of the boat where the trolling motor is. On the 10th of July, law enforcement was called. And you may hear that call, and you can make your observations about that call. But she's calling and is hysterical. I think Dan committed suicide. I heard a gunshot. Here, it is very common for Dan to fire guns, and he's a large parcel in Athol to fire guns. And so I don't know if we'll have an answer why that would surprise her. But law enforcement shows up, and she specifically denies any physical abuse. They are in Dorshak, and you'll see pictures of them at Dorshak, loving, in a bathing suit, bruise showing. But that is the basis of the battery charge. During this time, Dan, for several years, has been working in construction. First in North Dakota, then in Alaska. He's working in the oil fields. 3 weeks on to 3 weeks off. Dan and Kendy were on the rocks. He came back 2 days late. He worked an extra 2 days. When they came back, they talked about divorce. They had stopped at Curly's. They then went home. And later that night, 911 gets a call. Now, she was on the phone with her lover, who then got in touch with the parents. You'll hear that the differences between those two, between July when she called 911 to where she was on the phone with someone else to have someone else call. Law enforcement shows up. Again, it's not in dark clothing. He's in like these tan greenish khakis and a sweatshirt. Coincidentally, the same clothes that were in the washer a few nights later. Officers stay there. She packs a bag, a Victoria's Secret travel bag, and leaves. She comes back the next day, brings beer and pizza. She spends the next 2 days, and they're filling out divorce paperwork. Ms. Howard is messaging her friends, saying he's being unalcohol, or we're dividing everything up. And you'll see photos of the paperwork that is partially filled out. Dan goes down with Brian on the first, and then on the second, they came back, and when they had a conversation, what's now on the paperwork is the new house. The house that was purchased is now on it. That was something that you'll hear about. What you'll see is Ms. Howard, when she was put in the body bag, they put bags on her hand to preserve for gunshot residue. They collected the gunshot residue. They sent it to the lab, but they didn't have the lab tested. We already talked about the DNA. The gun was not, the gun had someone else's DNA and her blood on it, but Dan is excluded from that gun. You'll see the blood amount. You'll hear that after a person is dead, the volume of blood will depend on a few variables, but generally blood will pump for, you'll hear, around maybe a half second or a little more, depending on the cause and manner of death. But the heart stops pumping. Also, the position of the body, you'll hear that. The person's lying down, the person's sitting up, the person's slumped. Where the injury is it below the heart, is it above the heart? Here, you'll see the blood. The injury was to intraoral, and you'll hear from both all the others that most intraoral gunshot wounds are suicide. But the odd part is most intraoral gunshot wounds have an upward trajectory. Now, this one, everyone agrees, is an even or slightly downward trajectory. But again, this is a different gun. And you'll hear from Dr. Desmond that one of the scenarios is that she held it with her thumb on the trigger, which would lower that angle of the gun. She also, you'll hear, has bruising on this hand from the impact of the gun. You'll see that her hand position and the gun position is consistent with suicide. when you see all the evidence, and we have concluded this case, the evidence is not impossible and has not been eliminated, and therefore we'll be asking you to find the defendant not